The blood on the barn door was still wet when Victoria Vaughn realized her husband was going to die, and she was going to have to plow 40 acres of Montana soil with only her hands and a mule to save them both from starvation. She stood in the doorway of their small cabin in Fort Benton, Montana, watching the spring rain turn the earth to mud while Clayton Xavier lay motionless in their bed, his legs swollen to twice its normal size from the rattlesnake bite that had dropped him 3 days ago. The doctor had come and gone, leaving behind morphine and little hope, muttering something about poison and prayer being all that was left now. Victoria was 22 years old, married only 8 months, and she had never plowed a field in her life. Victoria. Clayton's voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from fever. The wheat. We need to get the wheat in the ground. She turned from the window, wiping her hands on her apron though they were already dry. His face was gray against the white pillowcase, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. Just 4 days ago he had been strong and laughing, spinning her around the kitchen after breakfast, talking about the future they would build on this land. Now he could not even lift his head. "Do not worry about the wheat," she said, crossing to the bed and pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. "You just focus on getting better." His hand caught hers, his grip surprisingly strong for a man so weakened. "If we do not plant now, we will have nothing come harvest. The window is closing. Every day we wait, we lose our chance." She knew he was right. It was late April in 1883, and the spring planting season was short in Montana. Their neighbors, the Hendersons, had already finished their plowing 2 weeks ago. The Carmichaels down the road were halfway through planting. But those families had healthy men, sons old enough to work the fields, hired hands who could shoulder the burden. Victoria and Clayton had only each other, and 40 acres that stretched out behind their cabin like an impossible ocean of earth. "Then I will do it," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Clayton's eyes widened, what little color remained in his face draining away. "No, you cannot. It is too much. The plow alone weighs more than you do, and that is before you factor in the mule's stubbornness. I have seen grown men give up after half an acre." "Then I suppose I will have to be stronger than a grown man," Victoria said. She meant it as a joke, but neither of them laughed. That night, after she had given Clayton his medicine and spooned thin broth into his mouth, she went out to the barn with a lantern. Their mule, a cantankerous beast named Samuel that Clayton had bought from a traveling merchant, regarded her with dark, distrustful eyes. The plow sat in the corner, its metal blade catching the lamplight, looking more like a medieval torture device than a farming implement. Victoria reached out and touched the wooden handles, worn smooth by Clayton's hands over the past months. Splinters caught at her palms. "Well, Samuel," she said to the mule, "I suppose we are about to become very well acquainted." The mule snorted and turned away, clearly unimpressed. She spent the next hour studying the plow, the harness, the way the leather straps connected to the metal fittings. She had watched Clayton plow their small kitchen garden dozens of times, but watching and doing were different countries separated by an ocean of ignorance. The harness alone was a puzzle of buckles and straps that made no sense in the lamplight. She worked until her fingers were numb and her eyes burned, until she thought she understood at least the basic mechanics of the thing. When she returned to the cabin, Clayton was awake despite the morphine. "You went to the barn," he said. "It was not a question." "I did." "Victoria, please." "We can sell the land. Move back to St. Louis. Your father would take us in until I am well." She sat on the edge of the bed, taking his hot hand in both of hers. "My father disowned me when I married you, or have you forgotten? He said you were a dreamer with empty pockets and foolish plans. He said I was throwing my life away on a man who would never amount to anything." She leaned forward, her voice fierce. "I chose this life, Clayton. I chose you. I chose Montana and this cabin and these 40 acres. I am not running back to St. Louis with my tail between my legs to prove my father right." "You could die out there," Clayton said, and his voice cracked. "The sun alone could kill you. Heat stroke, dehydration, exhaustion. And that is before we consider injury. If the plow blade catches a rock and kicks back, it could break your leg, your ribs. If Samuel bolts and you cannot let go of the handles in time, he could drag you half a mile before he stops. I have seen it happen, Victoria. I have seen what farming does to people who know what they are doing. You are a city girl who had never collected an egg before we married." "Then I will learn," she said simply. "Just as I learned to collect eggs, just as I learned to bake bread and churn butter and slaughter chickens and everything else I did not know how to do 8 months ago. You told me I was capable of anything. You told me I was the strongest person you had ever met. Were those just pretty words, or did you mean them?" Clayton's eyes filled with tears, and she had never loved him more than in that moment, seeing him so broken and still trying to protect her. "I meant every word," he whispered, "but I never wanted you to have to prove it like this." She kissed his forehead, tasting salt and fever. "Then watch me," she said. "Watch me from this bed and tell me how to do it right. Be my eyes and my teacher. If I am going to do this impossible thing, I need you with me every step of the way." He was quiet for a long moment, and she thought perhaps he had fallen asleep. Then his hand tightened on hers. "Start with the North 40, he said finally. "The soil is softer there, fewer rocks. And for God's sake, wear my work gloves. Your hands will be hamburger by the end of the first day otherwise." She smiled, blinking back her own tears. "See, you are helping already." The next morning, Victoria woke before dawn. She dressed in her oldest dress, a faded blue cotton thing that had seen better days, and tied her long brown hair back with a strip of leather. She ate a cold breakfast of bread and cheese, not wanting to waste time with the stove, then helped Clayton to the chair by the window. He could not walk, could barely stand even with her support, but she managed to get him positioned where he could see out across the fields. She piled pillows around him to keep him upright and brought him water and the last of the morphine. "I will need you to shout instructions," she said. "I will be too far away to hear normal conversation once I get going. If I had the strength to shout, I would have the strength to plow," Clayton said, but there was a hint of his old humor in his eyes. "I will do my best." She kissed him, long and deep, trying to pour all her fear and determination and love into that single moment. Then she went out to face the mule. Samuel was even less cooperative in daylight than he had been by lamplight. He danced away from the harness, tossed his head, and at one point actually tried to bite her shoulder. Victoria, who had spent the first 22 years of her life in polite St. Louis society, said words she had never spoken aloud before. She wrestled with leather and buckles and stubborn mule for what felt like hours, until finally, miraculously, Samuel was hitched to the plow. The field stretched before her, 40 acres of wild Montana grassland that needed to be turned and tamed. She wrapped her hands around the plow handles, feeling the weight of them even before the mule took a single step. The work gloves were too large, Clayton's hands bigger than hers, but she would rather swim in leather than have no protection at all. "Walk on," she called to Samuel, using the command she had heard Clayton use 100 times. The mule did not move. "Walk on," she repeated, louder. Samuel flicked one ear but remained planted. Victoria looked back toward the cabin. Through the window she could see Clayton's silhouette. He raised one hand, made a gesture she could not quite interpret. She tried to remember everything she had ever seen him do with the mule. The crop. She had forgotten the crop. She retrieved it from where it hung on the fence post, a long switch of willow that Clayton used more for show than actual striking. The moment Samuel saw it, his entire demeanor changed. He leaned into the harness, the leather creaking, and the plow blade bit into the earth. They were moving. The first furrow was a disaster. The blade caught and skipped, creating a jagged line that looked like a drunk man's signature. Samuel pulled too fast, then too slow, then stopped entirely to investigate something interesting in the dirt. Victoria's arms burned from trying to hold the plow steady, and she had not even completed 20 yards. By the time they reached the end of the field and she managed to turn the mule around for the second pass, her shoulders were screaming and sweat was running into her eyes despite the cool morning air. But the second furrow was slightly better than the first, and the third was better than the second. By noon, she had completed 6 full rows, and while they were far from perfect, they were at least relatively straight. Her hands, even protected by the gloves, were starting to blister. Her back felt like someone had beaten it with a board. Her legs trembled every time she tried to adjust her stance. She left Samuel hitched and walked back to the cabin on unsteady legs. Clayton was exactly where she had left him, though his head had drooped forward in sleep. She did not wake him. Instead, she ate quickly, drank deeply from the well, and returned to the field. The afternoon was harder than the morning. The sun climbed higher, turning the cool spring day into something that hinted at the summer heat to come. Victoria's dress stuck to her back with sweat. The blisters on her palms burst and reformed. Her arms stopped burning and went numb, which she decided was either very good or very bad, but either way meant she could keep going. Samuel seemed to sense her exhaustion and became increasingly difficult, stopping every few minutes to rest, veering off course to explore interesting patches of grass. By the time the sun started its descent toward the western mountains, Victoria had completed perhaps an acre, maybe less. She stood at the edge of the field, looking at what she had accomplished and what remained, and the mathematics of the situation hit her like a physical blow. 1 acre in 1 day meant 40 days to complete the field. They did not have 40 days. They had maybe 2 weeks before the planting window closed entirely. She looked back at the cabin. Clayton was awake now, watching her through the window. Even at this distance, she could see the concern on his face. She wanted to cry. She wanted to sit down in the dirt and sob until there were no tears left. Instead, she raised one hand and waved, trying to make the gesture cheerful and confident. Then she turned back to the field and kept plowing. Darkness fell, and she worked by moonlight until she literally could not see the ground in front of her. When she finally unhitched Samuel and stumbled back to the cabin, her hands were bleeding through the gloves, and her legs could barely support her weight. Clayton took one look at her face and tried to get up from the chair, actually managed to stand for a moment before his ruined leg gave out, and he collapsed back into the pillows with a cry of pain. "Do not," Victoria said sharply, rushing to him despite her exhaustion. "Do not you dare hurt yourself worse trying to help me. Your hands," he said, reaching for them. She pulled away, "are fine, just blisters. They will toughen up." "Victoria, you cannot do this. 1 day and you look half dead. What will you look like after a week? After 2? "Like someone who saved our farm," she said. She helped him back to the bed, ignoring his protests, then collapsed into the chair herself. Every muscle in her body was staging a revolt. She could not remember ever being this tired, not even during the cholera epidemic in St. Louis when she had volunteered at the hospital and worked 30-hour shifts. Clayton was quiet while she bandaged her hands with strips of clean cloth. Then he said, "I am going to tell you something and I need you to listen, really listen." She looked up at him. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever known," he said. When I met you at your father's Christmas party, this society girl in a silk dress who could discuss philosophy and art and politics with equal ease, I thought you were beautiful but untouchable, a hothouse flower. Then you smiled at me, this poor cowboy who had been invited only because my uncle knew your father's business partner, and you asked me about Montana like it was the most fascinating place on earth. You wanted to know about the mountains and the rivers and the sky. You wanted to know what freedom felt like. I remember, Victoria said softly. I fell in love with you that night, Clayton continued, but I also underestimated you. I thought you would want a frontier adventure for a few months, then retreat back to civilization when the reality set in. Instead, you learned to shoot a rifle and plant a garden and make soap from lye. You befriended the Blackfeet woman who sold herbs at the trading post and learned to identify medicinal plants. You turned this cabin into a home. You proved me wrong about everything. Where are you going with this? Victoria asked, though her heart was already answering. I am saying that if anyone can do this impossible thing, it is you. I am saying I believe in you, but I am also saying that I will not love you less if you cannot. If you have to stop, if it is too much, I will not think less of you. We will find another way. Victoria felt tears spill down her cheeks, hot and unexpected. There is no other way, she whispered. You know that. Then I will be here, Clayton said. Every day watching from this window, telling you everything I know. You will not be alone in this. She nodded, unable to speak, and they sat in silence until the moon rose high enough to spill silver light through the window. The second day was worse than the first. Victoria woke to hands so swollen she could barely hold a spoon, let alone plow handles. Her back had seized up during the night, and it took her 20 minutes of careful stretching before she could stand fully upright. But she dressed, she ate, she helped Clayton to his chair, and she went out to the field. Samuel seemed to sense her weakness and took full advantage, fighting her at every turn. The plow felt heavier, the furrows less straight, the sun hotter despite the morning coolness. She completed half the distance she had managed the previous day, and by noon she was ready to admit defeat. Then she heard Clayton's voice, faint but clear, carried on the wind. Shorter passes, he was shouting. Do not try for the full length. Turn around sooner, give yourself breaks. She looked back at the cabin. He was leaning out the window as far as he could manage, one hand cupped around his mouth. The effort was clearly costing him, his face twisted with pain from the movement, but he was trying. Victoria adjusted her approach, cutting the field into smaller sections as he suggested. It helped. The rows were shorter, the turns more frequent, but she could manage the shorter distances. By evening, she had matched the previous day's progress. It was not enough, would never be enough at this rate, but it was something. On the third day, her body began to adapt. The blisters on her palms hardened into calluses. Her muscles, shocked into submission by 2 days of unprecedented labor, found a rhythm. She and Samuel reached a kind of détente, the mule seeming to understand that she was not going away and resistance was futile. The furrows grew straighter, the pace steadier. She completed an acre and a half. Clayton watched from his window, shouting advice when the wind was right, gesturing when it was not. He told her when to rest, when to push harder, when the blade was cutting too deep or too shallow. He could not walk, could barely move, but he guided her through every foot of soil like a captain navigating treacherous waters. On the fourth day, it rained. Not the gentle spring showers that coaxed flowers from the ground, but a heavy, driving rain that turned the field to thick mud and made plowing nearly impossible. Victoria worked anyway, sliding in the muck, fighting to keep the plow blade from getting stuck every few feet. She made it halfway through the morning before admitting that she was doing more harm than good, churning the soil into an unplantable mess. She returned to the cabin soaked and shivering to find Clayton in tears. "I should be out there," he said, his voice breaking. "You should not have to do this alone. What kind of man watches his wife destroy herself while he sits useless by a window?" Victoria stripped off her wet clothes without modesty, too cold and tired to care, and wrapped herself in a blanket. "The kind of man who was bitten by a rattlesnake," she said practically. "The kind of man who would be dead if he tried to walk on that leg. The kind of man who is keeping me from giving up by believing I can do this." "I am not sure I do believe it anymore," Clayton admitted. "I look at what is left to plow and the time remaining, and the numbers do not work, Victoria. Even if you work every day from dawn until dark, even if you somehow double your pace, you will not finish in time. And what then? We will have a partially plowed field and no wheat and no harvest and no money to survive the winter." She sat on the edge of the bed, taking his face in her work-roughened hands. "Then we will figure something else out, but I am not stopping. Not yet. Not while there is still a chance." The rain continued for 2 days, turning their small world into a muddy prison. Victoria spent the time mending harnesses, sharpening the plow blade, preparing seed wheat for planting. She also tended to Clayton, changing his bandages, dosing him with medicine, watching helplessly as the swelling in his leg slowly, painfully began to recede. The doctor had said if he survived the first week, he would likely survive altogether. They were on day 6. On the 7th day, the sun returned, and Victoria went back to the field with a vengeance. The rain had softened the soil, making plowing easier, and she flew through 2 acres before noon. Her confidence soared. Maybe they could do this after all. Maybe determination and stubbornness could overcome impossible mathematics. Then Samuel stepped in a hidden gopher hole and went down screaming. Victoria's heart stopped as the mule thrashed and bellowed, his front leg bent at an unnatural angle. She managed to get him unhitched from the plow before he hurt himself worse, but the damage was clear. His leg was broken. A broken leg on a mule was a death sentence. They could not afford a veterinarian, and even if they could, there was no guarantee the leg would heal well enough for the animal to work again. She sat in the mud next to the injured mule, listening to him cry, and felt the last of her hope drain away. Without Samuel, she had no way to pull the plow. Without the plow, she had no way to finish the field. Without the field, they had no crop. Without the crop, they had nothing. "I am so sorry," she whispered to the mule, running her hand along his neck. "I pushed you too hard. This is my fault." She was still sitting there an hour later when she heard the sound of hoofbeats. She looked up to see a rider approaching, a tall figure on a bay horse. As he drew closer, she recognized him as Caleb Henderson, their nearest neighbor. He was around Clayton's age, late 20s, with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes. His family's ranch bordered their property to the north. "Mrs. Xavier," he called, dismounting. "I saw from our north pasture that your mule was down. Thought I would ride over and see if you needed help." His eyes took in the scene, the broken-legged mule, the plow sitting idle in the half-finished field, Victoria's mud-covered dress and exhausted face. "What in God's name are you doing out here alone?" Pride made Victoria want to send him away, to insist she had everything under control. But practicality won out. "Clayton was bitten by a rattlesnake a week ago," she said. "He cannot walk, much less plow. I have been trying to get the field ready for planting, but now Samuel is injured and I do not know what to do." Caleb knelt next to the mule, running experienced hands over the broken leg. "It is a clean break," he said after a moment. "I can splint it, and he might heal up enough to be useful again by next season, but he will not be pulling any plows for a good long while." "Then we are finished," Victoria said flatly. We have maybe a week left to plant, and I have barely plowed a quarter of the field." Caleb stood, brushing dirt from his knees. He looked at the field, then back at the cabin where Victoria could see Clayton's silhouette in the window, then at Victoria herself. "I will help you," he said. "What?" "I will bring over my team of horses tomorrow morning, and we will finish this field together. My own planting is done, and my boys can handle the regular ranch work for a few days. No sense in watching good people lose everything when I have the means to help." Victoria felt tears spring to her eyes for what felt like the 100th time that week. "Mr. Henderson, I cannot ask you to do that. You have your own work, your own family to care for. You are not asking. I am offering. That is what neighbors do out here, Mrs. Xavier. We help each other survive." He smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "Besides, I remember when Clayton helped me round up my cattle last fall when they got spooked by that lightning storm. I owe him at least 40 acres worth of plowing." He splinted Samuel's leg with practiced efficiency, then helped Victoria guide the limping mule back to the barn. The whole time, she felt like she was living in a dream, like this sudden reversal of fortune could not possibly be real. But Caleb Henderson was solid and real and promising to return at dawn with his draft horses. When she told Clayton, expecting relief and gratitude, his reaction surprised her. His face went dark, his jaw tight. "Absolutely not. We will not accept charity from the Hendersons." "It is not charity, it is neighborliness," Victoria argued. "He said you helped him last fall with his cattle." "I spent one afternoon helping him. He is proposing to spend days plowing our field." "That is not an equal exchange. So what are you suggesting? That I tell him no and we just give up?" "I am suggesting that my wife should not be spending days alone in a field with another man while I lie here helpless," Clayton snapped, then immediately looked horrified. "I am sorry. I did not mean that the way it sounded." Victoria stared at him. "Are you saying you do not trust me, or you do not trust him?" "I am saying I hate this. I hate being injured. I hate watching you work yourself to death. I hate that another man can provide what I cannot. I hate all of it." He turned his face away, but not before she saw the shine of tears in his eyes. She sat beside him on the bed, taking his hand. "I love you," she said. "Only you. Caleb Henderson is a kind man offering help in a desperate situation, nothing more. And if our positions were reversed, if it was his wife who needed help and you were able to provide it, you would do the same without a second thought." "I know," Clayton whispered. "I know you are right. It is just my pride talking." "Then tell your pride to be quiet and let practical people save our farm," Victoria said, and was rewarded with a weak smile. Caleb Henderson arrived the next morning with 2 massive draft horses and his oldest son, a boy of about 16 named James. The boy had his father's quiet competence and set about hitching the horses to the plow without needing instruction. Within minutes, they were ready to work. "I will take the first few passes, show James the lay of your land," Caleb said. "Then he can take over and I will start on the west section with your plow once we get your mule situation sorted." "You are going to plow with 2 teams at once?" Victoria asked, incredulous. "No sense doing this halfway when we are already here," Caleb said. "James, you remember what I taught you about keeping the furrows straight?" The boy nodded, and they set to work. Victoria had planned to work alongside them, but Caleb waved her away. "You have been at this for over a week by yourself. Take a day to rest. You have earned it." She wanted to argue, but her body was singing a chorus of agreement with Caleb's suggestion. Instead, she went inside and spent the day caring for Clayton, cooking a proper meal for the first time in days, and watching through the window as the Hendersons transformed their wild field into neat rows of turned earth with a speed that seemed almost magical. Clayton watched too, his feelings clearly complicated. "They are making good progress," he said finally, grudgingly. "They are saving us," Victoria corrected. "I should be grateful." "But you are not," he sighed. I truly am, but gratitude and shame are apparently not mutually exclusive." By the end of the first day, Caleb and James had plowed more than Victoria had managed in her entire week of effort. By the end of the second day, they were more than halfway done with the entire 40 acres. Caleb refused to come inside the cabin, seeming to sense that Clayton needed his pride protected as much as possible. But he accepted water and food from Victoria at the door and reported their progress like a foreman reporting to a boss. On the third day, Victoria insisted on working alongside them despite Caleb's protests. Her hands had healed enough to hold a plow handle again, and her muscles, though still sore, had adapted to the work. Caleb gave her the east section, the smallest and flattest portion of the remaining field, and she attacked it with renewed energy. They worked in a strange kind of harmony, 3 people and 3 teams spread across 40 acres, racing the calendar and the weather. James, who had been shy and quiet at first, began to open up, telling stories about life on his family's ranch, asking Victoria questions about St. Louis that made her nostalgic for a life she had left behind. Caleb worked with quiet intensity, his presence steady and reassuring, occasionally calling out advice or encouragement. On the 4th day they finished, all 40 acres, plowed and ready for seed. Victoria stood at the edge of the field as the sun set, looking at the transformed land, and felt a sense of accomplishment so profound it brought fresh tears. They had done the impossible. Well, she had done about 10 acres worth of impossible, and Caleb and James had done the rest, but it felt shared somehow, a communal victory over circumstance and mathematics and snakebite fate. Caleb rode over to where she stood, his horses blowing hard from their final push. "That is fine work, Mrs. Xavier. You should be proud." "I am," she said, "and grateful, more grateful than I can properly express. You have given us our future back." He looked uncomfortable with the praise, adjusting his hat and studying the horizon. "Like I said, it is what neighbors do." "Now comes the hard part." "The hard part? This was not the hard part," he laughed. "Plowing is the easy part. Planting is where you earn your keep. That seed wheat needs to go in the ground starting tomorrow if you want any hope of a good harvest. You think you are up for it?" Victoria thought about her blistered hands, her aching back, her exhausted body. Then she thought about Clayton watching from the window, about the faith he had shown in her, about the land they were building a life on. "Yes," she said. "I am up for it," Caleb nodded. "Then I will leave you to it. My wife is probably wondering if I have taken up permanent residence at the Xavier farm." He paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "If you need anything, Mrs. Xavier, anything at all, you send word. And tell your husband that when he is back on his feet, I have a whole list of projects he can help me with to even the scales." "I will tell him," Victoria promised. After the Hendersons left, she went inside to find Clayton sitting up in bed, looking stronger than he had in days. The swelling in his leg had gone down significantly, and some color had returned to his face. "The doctor was right," he said. "1 week was the critical point. I think I am going to live after all." "Good," Victoria said, collapsing into the chair beside him. "Because I did not plow 40 acres just to become a widow." He reached for her hand, pulling her closer. "I need to say something, and I need you to let me say it all the way through without interrupting." She nodded. "I was wrong to feel anything but gratitude toward Caleb Henderson. He did something I could not do, and he did it out of kindness and decency, and all the things that make this frontier life bearable instead of brutal. But watching him work beside you these past few days, watching him make you laugh and seeing you smile at him in a way you had not smiled at me in over a week. I felt something ugly and small inside me. Jealousy, fear, insecurity. All the things I promised myself I would never feel because I absolutely knew, that you loved me and only me. Clayton, Victoria started, but he squeezed her hand. Let me finish. I realized something watching from that window. I realized that my worst fear is not that you will stop loving me. It is that you will realize you deserve better than a snake-bitten cowboy with 40 acres and a dream. You could have married that banker's son your father wanted for you. You could have had a townhouse in St. Louis and servants and a life of ease. Instead, you got me and mud and a week of hell trying to save a farm that might fail anyway. Victoria waited until she was certain he was finished. Then she said, "Are you done?" "I am done." "Good. Now you listen to me, Clayton Xavier. I did not marry you for your land or your prospects or your ability to plow a straight furrow. I married you because you were the first person in my entire life who looked at me and saw someone real instead of someone decorative. You wanted to know what I thought about things, not just how I looked in a ball gown. You treated me like a partner instead of a prize. And yes, Caleb Henderson is a good man who helped us when we desperately needed it, and I am grateful to him in a way I will probably never be able to properly repay. But I do not love him. I love you. I will always love you, even when you are being stubborn and prideful and insecure." Clayton pulled her down to kiss him, and for the first time in over a week, she felt the future open up before them again like a door swinging wide. Planting the wheat took another week of backbreaking work, but it was easier somehow than the plowing had been. Victoria developed a rhythm, walking the rows with a seed bag slung across her shoulder, broadcasting the wheat in careful handfuls, covering it with soil kicked up by her boots. Clayton watched from the window, continuing to heal slowly but steadily, offering advice and encouragement. By the end of the week, he could stand with the help of a crutch, and by the end of the second week, he could hobble out to the porch and sit in the sun while Victoria finished the final acres. When she planted the last seed and walked back to the cabin, he was waiting for her with a cup of cool water and tears running down his face. "You did it," he said. "You actually did it." "We did it," she corrected. "You and me and Caleb Henderson and James and even Samuel with his broken leg. We all did it." That night, they made love for the first time since the snake bite, careful of his still healing leg, gentle with her exhausted body, but fierce in their need for each other. Afterward, lying tangled together in the narrow bed, Clayton said, "I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you." "You already are," Victoria said. "You always have been." The wheat grew through May and June, green shoots pushing up through the Montana soil, reaching for the endless sky. Clayton's leg healed slowly, leaving him with a permanent limp but full mobility. He worked alongside Victoria through the summer, tending the crop, fighting off birds and rabbits and all the other threats that stood between seed and harvest. They were happy in a way that felt earned, their love deepened by the trial they had endured together. In late July, Caleb Henderson rode over with news. "Thought you would want to know that Samuel is putting weight on his leg again, still limping pretty bad, but the bone set clean. He might be able to do light work by next spring." "That is wonderful news," Victoria said, and meant it. Despite the mule's stubborn nature, she had grown fond of him during their week of shared struggle. Caleb nodded, then seemed to hesitate. "There is something else. My wife, Martha, wanted me to invite you both to dinner next Sunday. She has been wanting to meet the woman who plowed her own field, and our daughter Rachel has been pestering me with questions about you for weeks. If Clayton is up for the ride, we would be honored to have you." Victoria looked at Clayton, who smiled. "We would love to come," he said. The dinner at the Henderson Ranch was a revelation. Martha Henderson turned out to be a warm, practical woman who ran her household with the same quiet efficiency her husband brought to farming. Their daughter Rachel, a bright-eyed girl of 14, peppered Victoria with questions about St. Louis and city life, and what it was like to be a lady learning to plow. James, the son who had helped with the plowing, treated Victoria with a kind of awed respect that made her both proud and embarrassed. Over roast beef and potatoes, the two families talked about crops and weather and the challenges of frontier life. Clayton and Caleb discovered they had similar ideas about irrigation and crop rotation. Martha and Victoria bonded over the difficulties of keeping a household running without easy access to supplies. By the end of the evening, Victoria felt like they had found not just neighbors, but true friends. As they rode home in the wagon, Clayton said, "I like them. I was ready to resent Caleb Henderson for the rest of my life, but I genuinely like the man." "He is a good person," Victoria agreed. "They all are." "I think we are going to make this work," Clayton said, gesturing at the darkening landscape around them. "This life, this place, I think we are going to be happy here." Victoria leaned against his shoulder, careful of his bad leg. "I think you are right." The harvest came in August, and it was better than they had dared hope. The wheat had thrived in the Montana soil, and when they brought in the crop, they had enough not only to pay their debts, but to put money aside for the winter and the next planting season. Clayton, still limping but strong enough to work a full day, handled the reaping while Victoria bundled and stacked. They worked side by side, partners in every sense of the word. Caleb and James came to help with the threshing, and this time Clayton accepted the assistance with grace and gratitude. The four of them worked for 3 days, separating grain from chaff, filling sacks with golden wheat, talking and laughing and building the kind of bonds that only shared labor can create. On the last day of the harvest, as the sun set over the mountains and painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, Clayton took Victoria's hand and led her to the middle of their field. "Stand here," he said, "right here in the center of everything you saved." She stood, confused, as he knelt down on his good knee. From his pocket, he pulled a small box. Inside was a ring, silver worked into the shape of a wheat stalk, the grain so delicate and detailed it looked almost real. "I know we are already married," he said, "but I had a blacksmith in town make this while you were finishing the planting. I wanted you to have something to remember this year, this season, this moment when you proved that love is not just a feeling, it is action. You showed me what it means to fight for the life you want, to refuse to give up even when giving up is the sensible thing to do. Victoria Vaughn Xavier, you are my partner, my love, my reason for believing in impossible things. Will you accept this ring as a promise that I will spend the rest of my life trying to be half as strong as you are?" Victoria felt tears stream down her face as she nodded, unable to speak. He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, the silver warm from being carried against his heart. When he stood, she threw her arms around him, kissing him hard enough to make him laugh and stumble backward. "Careful," he said. "I am still recovering." "You are fine," she said. "You are perfect. We are perfect." They stood in the center of their 40 acres as darkness fell, holding each other while the first stars appeared overhead. The field around them was stubble now, stripped bare by the harvest, but Victoria could already imagine next spring's planting, next summer's growth, next fall's harvest. An endless cycle of death and rebirth, struggle and triumph, the land and their love sustaining each other season after season. Winter came, and with it the deep snows that buried Montana in white silence. Clayton and Victoria spent the dark months close to the fire, planning for the next year, reading to each other from the books they had brought from St. Louis, learning new dimensions of each other in the quiet intimacy of confinement. Clayton taught her to play chess, and she taught him to enjoy poetry. They made love on wool blankets while the wind howled outside, their bodies warming each other against the cold. In February, Victoria woke one morning feeling strange. Not sick, exactly, but different in a way she could not quite name. She spent the morning watching Clayton work on repairing a harness, feeling oddly emotional about the way his hands moved, the concentration on his face, the simple fact of his existence. When he caught her staring and smiled, she burst into tears. "What is wrong?" he asked, alarmed, crossing to her immediately. "I do not know," she sobbed. "Nothing, everything, I am being ridiculous." He held her until the crying passed, then stepped back and looked at her with a strange expression. "Victoria, when was the last time you had your monthly courses?" She opened her mouth to answer, then stopped. When was the last time? She tried to remember, counting backward through the weeks. November, maybe, possibly early December, but certainly not January, and they were already halfway through February. "Oh," she said softly. "Oh." They stared at each other for a long moment, the possibility hanging between them like something physical and real. Then Clayton laughed, a sound of pure joy, and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around the small cabin. "We are going to have a baby," he said. "Victoria, we are going to have a baby." "We do not know that for certain," she cautioned, but she was laughing too, caught up in his excitement. "I know," he said. "I know it the same way I knew you would be able to plow that field even when logic said it was impossible. I know it in my bones." He was right. As the weeks passed and her body changed in unmistakable ways, the truth became clear. By next fall, they would be 3 instead of 2. The news gave their spring planting an extra dimension of urgency and hope. They were not just planting for themselves anymore, but for the child who would grow up on this land, who would learn to love Montana the way they had learned to love it. This year, Clayton did most of the plowing, his leg having healed enough to handle the work, but Victoria insisted on helping despite his protests. "I am pregnant, not fragile," she said. "Women have been working while pregnant since the dawn of time." They fell into an easy partnership, switching off duties as her pregnancy progressed. When her belly grew too large to handle the plow, she took over the planting. When her back ached too much to bend over seed bags, she drove the wagon while Clayton loaded it. They adapted and adjusted, learning the rhythms of working together, building the farm not as his project or hers, but as theirs. In May, Martha Henderson rode over with a basket of baby clothes her own children had outgrown. "Rachel has been knitting blankets for you," she said. "I think she has made about a dozen by now. She is very excited about the baby." Victoria invited her in for tea, and the two women spent the afternoon talking about pregnancy and childbirth, and the joys and terrors of raising children on the frontier. Martha had delivered all 4 of her children at home with only a midwife for assistance, and she shared stories that were both reassuring and terrifying in equal measure. "The important thing is not to be afraid," Martha said. "Your body knows what to do. Trust it, and trust Clayton to be there for you. Men are mostly useless during childbirth, but having someone who loves you nearby makes all the difference." As summer deepened and Victoria's belly swelled, she found herself thinking often about the field she had plowed while Clayton watched from his sickbed. The memory seemed distant now, like something that had happened to a different person in a different life. But she could still feel the ghost of those blisters on her palms, still remember the bone-deep exhaustion and the stubborn determination that had kept her going. That experience had changed her in ways she was still discovering, had taught her that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. In late September, 2 weeks before the harvest was due to begin, Victoria's water broke in the middle of the night. Clayton, who had been sleeping lightly for weeks in anticipation of this moment, was up and moving immediately. He rode through the darkness to fetch the midwife, a capable older woman named Mrs. Chen who lived in town, then returned to find Victoria pacing the cabin, breathing through contractions. The labor lasted 14 hours, and it was every bit as difficult and painful and transformative as Martha had described. Clayton stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, whispering encouragement when she was certain she could not continue. When the baby finally emerged, screaming and perfect and impossibly small, Victoria burst into tears of exhaustion and relief and overwhelming love. "A boy," Mrs. Chen announced, cleaning the infant and wrapping him in one of Rachel's hand-knitted blankets. "A healthy, strong boy." Clayton took his son with shaking hands, staring down at the tiny face with an expression of such wonder that Victoria felt her heart expand. "He is perfect," Clayton whispered. "Victoria, he is perfect." They named him Thomas, after Clayton's father who had died before they married, and from the moment he entered their lives, everything changed. The cabin that had felt spacious for two became cramped with three, especially when Thomas decided to exercise his lungs at 2 in the morning. The work of the farm continued, but now it had to be scheduled around feedings and naps and all the 100 tiny needs of an infant. But the joy of him, the absolute wonder of this small person they had created together, made every difficulty worthwhile. Victoria would stand over his cradle, watching him sleep, marveling at his tiny fingers and the way his chest rose and fell with each breath. Clayton would carry him out to the field, tucking him into a basket in the shade while they worked, stopping every few minutes to check on him. The harvest that year was even better than the first, and they celebrated by hosting the Hendersons for dinner. Rachel was instantly smitten with baby Thomas, begging to hold him and cooing over his every movement. James, now 17 and nearly a man, talked with Clayton about farming techniques, while Martha and Victoria compared notes on the challenges of keeping an infant happy. As the evening wound down and the Hendersons prepared to leave, Caleb pulled Clayton aside. "I have been thinking," he said. "Next spring, what would you say to going in together on some equipment? A proper thresher, maybe some better plows. If we pool our resources, we could both afford better tools and we could share the use of them." Clayton glanced at Victoria, who nodded. "I think that is a fine idea," he said. "Partners, partners," Caleb agreed, and they shook on it. Over the following years, the partnership between the Xaviers and the Hendersons deepened. They shared equipment, shared labor during busy seasons, shared in the successes and failures that came with frontier farming. Rachel Henderson became a regular presence at the Xavier cabin, helping Victoria with Thomas and later with his siblings, learning from Victoria about running a household and from Clayton about working the land. Thomas was 2 when his sister Caroline was born, a loud and demanding infant who seemed determined to make her presence known from the moment she entered the world. Clayton, who had been hoping for a daughter, was completely besotted, carrying her everywhere and letting her tug on his beard while he worked. 3 years after Caroline came another boy, whom they named Matthew. He was a quiet baby, content to observe the world with serious eyes, so different from his boisterous older siblings that Victoria sometimes wondered if they had been given the wrong child at birth. But he had Clayton's eyes and her stubborn chin, and he was theirs without question. The farm prospered. Year by year, the 40 acres that Victoria had helped plow while Clayton watched from his sickbed produced wheat and oats and hay. They bought more land, expanding their holdings, building a larger house to accommodate their growing family. Samuel, the mule who had broken his leg that desperate spring, lived to a ripe old age, eventually retiring to a shaded pasture where he watched the work from a distance with what Victoria swore was a judgmental expression. When Thomas was 10 and started asking about how his parents had met, Victoria and Clayton sat their children down and told them the story. They told about the Christmas party in St. Louis, about the decision to move west, about the rattlesnake and the desperate plowing and the kindness of neighbors. They told about fear and determination and love that expressed itself through action rather than words. Caroline, who was 8 and dramatic, declared it the most romantic story she had ever heard. Matthew, who was 5 and practical, wanted to know if the rattlesnake had survived. Thomas, thoughtful and serious like his mother, asked, "Were you scared?" "Terrified," Victoria admitted. "Every single day, but I was more scared of giving up than I was of failing." "That is what courage is," Clayton added. "Not the absence of fear, but doing what needs to be done despite the fear." As the years passed, Victoria sometimes walked out to the original 40 acres, now just one portion of their much larger farm, and remembered that desperate spring. She would stand in the center of the field, feeling the Montana wind on her face, and think about the young woman she had been. The city girl in muddy skirts wrestling with a stubborn mule and an impossible task. That woman felt both intimately familiar and completely foreign, as if Victoria had somehow become a different person while still remaining herself. Clayton found her there one evening when Thomas was 15, Caroline 13, and Matthew 10. The children were back at the house finishing their chores, and the two of them had stolen a moment of quiet together, something that was increasingly rare as the farm and the family demanded more and more of their time. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "About how far we have come," she said. "About how that spring when you were bitten by the snake feels like a lifetime ago and also like yesterday." "I still dream about it sometimes," Clayton admitted. "I dream I am sitting at that window, watching you work yourself to death, unable to help. I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I have failed you somehow." Victoria turned in his arms to face him. "You have never failed me, not once, not ever. I could not plow the field. But you guided me through it. You believed in me when I did not believe in myself. That was the help I needed, Clayton. Not someone to do it for me, but someone to believe I could do it myself." He kissed her, slow and deep, the kiss of people who had been married long enough to know each other's rhythms and responses. When they pulled apart, he said, "Do you ever regret it? Choosing this life instead of the easy one your father wanted for you?" "Not even for a moment," Victoria said, and meant it with her whole heart. They stood together in the field as the sun set, painting the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson, the same sky that had watched over them through drought and plenty, sickness and health, desperation and triumph. In the distance, they could hear their children's voices raised in laughter or argument. It was hard to tell which. Samuel's grandson, a mule they had named Samuel II in honor of his stubborn predecessor, brayed from the barn. The wheat in the field rustled in the evening breeze, ready for the next day's harvest. "Thank you," Clayton said quietly. "For what?" "For plowing the field, for saving us, for giving me a life I never dreamed I could have." Victoria smiled. "Thank you for being worth saving." They walked back to the house hand in hand, their shadows stretching long before them in the fading light. Inside, their children waited, noisy and demanding and perfect. Outside, the land waited, patient and eternal, ready to be worked and loved and passed down to the next generation. And between the two, Victoria and Clayton had built something remarkable, A life and a love forged in the crucible of that desperate spring, tempered by years of shared labor and mutual devotion, strong enough to last all their days and beyond. The years continued to turn, bringing new challenges and new joys. Thomas grew into a serious young man with his mother's determination and his father's love of the land. He took naturally to farming, asking intelligent questions about crop rotation and soil management, spending hours working alongside Clayton in the fields. By the time he was 18, he was more partner than son in the running of the farm. Caroline, fiery and independent, shocked everyone by announcing at 16 that she intended to study medicine. "I want to be a doctor," she declared over dinner one night. "I want to learn how to save people like the doctor who helped Pa when he was snake-bitten, except I want to be good at it." Victoria, who had long since learned not to tell her daughter that something was impossible, simply asked, "Where would you study?" "There is a women's medical college in Philadelphia," Caroline said. "I have been writing to them. They say if I can pass their entrance examinations, they will admit me." Clayton looked like he had been hit with a board. "Philadelphia, that is halfway across the country." "I know, Pa, but it is where I need to go to become who I need to be. You and Ma taught me that. You taught me that sometimes you have to do the hard thing, the impossible thing, because the alternative is giving up on your dreams." Victoria reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "Then we will find a way to make it happen." Matthew, quietest of the three children, surprised them all by showing a talent for working with horses. What had started as a simple affinity grew into something approaching genius. By the time he was 12, he could gentle a wild horse faster than anyone in the territory. By 15, he was earning money breaking horses for neighboring ranches. He was soft-spoken and patient, with an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that seemed almost supernatural. "I think I got it from Ma," he said once, when Clayton asked about his gift. "She figured out how to work with Samuel when nobody else could. I just do the same thing but with horses instead of mules." In 1904, when Victoria was 44 and Clayton 46, they celebrated 21 years of marriage with a party that brought together friends and neighbors from across the territory. The Hendersons were there, of course, Caleb and Martha now grandparents several times over, James married with children of his own, Rachel engaged to a school teacher from Helena. The barn was decorated with lanterns and wildflowers, and someone had brought a fiddle, filling the Montana night with music. Victoria danced with Clayton, her head resting on his shoulder, moving slowly to a waltz. His limp was barely noticeable now, just a slight hitch in his step that only appeared when he was tired. Her hair had threads of silver running through the brown, and his beard was more gray than black. But when she looked up at him, she saw the same man who had spun her around a ballroom in St. Louis 22 years ago, the cowboy who had talked about Montana like it was a kind of promised land. "Are you happy?" he asked, echoing a question he had asked 1,000 times over the years. "Deliriously," she answered, giving the same response she always did. Later that night, after the guests had gone home and the children were asleep, they walked out to the original 40 acres one more time. The field was empty now, resting between plantings, the soil dark and rich under the starlight. "I have been thinking about that spring," Clayton said. "The snakebite spring, as I have come to think of it. I have been thinking about how it was the worst thing and the best thing that ever happened to us." "How do you figure the best?" Victoria asked. "Because it showed us what we were made of. It tested us in ways we never would have been tested otherwise, and we passed. We did not just survive, we thrived. And everything that came after, every challenge we faced it knowing that if we could get through that spring, we could get through anything." Victoria thought about this. She thought about plowing in the mud and rain, about blistered hands and a broken mule, about Clayton watching helplessly from the window, about Caleb Henderson's kindness, about the wheat growing green and gold in the summer sun, about Thomas and Caroline and Matthew, about 21 years of building a life from raw land and stubborn determination. "You are right," she said finally. "It was the best worst thing that ever happened to us." They stood in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of Montana, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of wind through grass, the soft lowing of cattle from the far pasture. Then Clayton said, "I love you, Victoria Vaughn Xavier. I have loved you from the moment I met you, and I will love you until the day I die and beyond if such things are possible." "They are possible," Victoria said. "I know they are, because I will love you the same way." Thomas took over the majority of the farm work when Clayton turned 50, and his back began to give him trouble. It was a gradual transition, father teaching son everything he knew, stepping back little by little until one day Victoria realized that Thomas was making the major decisions, and Clayton was the advisor. It could have been difficult, could have bruised Clayton's pride the way accepting help from Caleb Henderson had all those years ago, but instead it felt natural and right, the proper order of things. Caroline left for Philadelphia in 1906, tearful and excited and terrified. She wrote letters home every week, detailing her studies, her struggles, her small triumphs in a world that did not always welcome women in medicine. 4 years later, she graduated near the top of her class and returned to Montana to set up a practice in Fort Benton. She never married, dedicating her life to healing instead, becoming the doctor who could do what the old doctor had failed to do for Clayton all those years ago. Matthew married at 23, a quiet wedding to a quiet woman named Sarah who shared his love of horses. They built a house on the western edge of the Xavier property and started a horse breeding program that quickly became renowned throughout Montana and beyond. Within 5 years, people were traveling from as far as California to buy Matthew Xavier's horses. Thomas married at 25, choosing a practical farmer's daughter named Elizabeth who fit into the family as if she had always been there. They gave Victoria and Clayton their first grandchild, a boy they named Clayton after his grandfather, and Victoria found herself experiencing a whole new dimension of love as she held her grandson for the first time. The years flowed by like water, sometimes rushing, sometimes slow, but always moving forward. Victoria's hair turned completely silver and Clayton's limp became more pronounced. They slowed down, letting the younger generation shoulder more of the work, but they never stopped being partners in the truest sense of the word. They still walked the fields together on summer evenings, still sat together by the fire in winter, still found ways to make each other laugh even after 30 years of marriage. In 1916, as war raged in Europe and the world seemed to be tearing itself apart, Victoria and Clayton celebrated their 33rd anniversary quietly at home. Their children and grandchildren came for dinner, filling the house with noise and laughter and life. After everyone had gone, Victoria found Clayton sitting on the porch, looking out at the fields. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him. "About how we built all this from nothing," he said. "About how that spring when I got snake-bitten and you plowed the field, I thought we were finished. I thought there was no way we could survive. But here we are, 33 years later, surrounded by children and grandchildren, living on land that we made productive through sheer stubbornness and hard work. It seems impossible when I think about it." "We made it possible," Victoria said. "Together." Clayton reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, calloused and worn and perfect. "I want you to know something," If I could go back and live my life over, change anything I wanted, I would not change a single thing. Not the snake bite, not the struggle, not any of it. Because all of it led to this moment, sitting here with you, having built something that will outlast us both. Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. I would not change anything either. Except maybe I would have learned to plow before we moved to Montana, would have saved us some trouble. Clayton laughed, the sound rich and full, and pulled her close. They sat together as the sun set over the mountains, over the land they had loved and worked and passed down to their children, over the 40 acres where their story had truly begun. Years later, when Victoria was 70 and Clayton 72, they took one last walk to the original field together. It was a warm summer evening and Clayton moved slowly, leaning heavily on a cane, but he refused help. Victoria walked beside him, her own steps careful but steady, still strong despite the decades. They stood in the center of the 40 acres, and Victoria could almost see ghosts of their younger selves. The desperate woman with her hands on plow handles, the injured man watching from the window, the kind neighbor who had come to help, the mule with his broken leg. All of it felt present somehow, folded into this moment like layers of time existing simultaneously. "Thank you," Victoria said softly. "For what?" Clayton asked. "For everything. For seeing me as more than a society girl, for bringing me to Montana. For believing I could plow this field when I did not believe it myself. For 39 years of partnership and love and building a life worth living." Clayton turned to face her, his eyes still the same warm brown she had fallen in love with all those years ago, even if they were now surrounded by wrinkles and age spots. "I should be thanking you. You saved my life that spring. Not just by plowing the field, but by choosing to fight instead of running away. You could have left me, could have gone back to St. Louis and your father's house and the easy life you had given up. But you stayed and you fought, and you built this incredible life with me. I am the luckiest man who ever lived." Victoria kissed him, soft and sweet, tasting summer and memory and enduring love. When they pulled apart, she said, "We should get back. Caroline will worry if we are gone too long." "Let her worry," Clayton said. "I want to stay here just a little longer. Want to remember what it felt like to be young and terrified and determined in this place." So they stayed, standing in the center of the 40 acres as the stars began to appear overhead. The same stars that had watched over them through decades of joy and struggle, the same stars that would continue to watch long after they were gone. And Victoria felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that what they had built together, the love and the land and the legacy, would continue in their children and grandchildren, generation after generation. All of it rooted in that desperate spring when she had plowed 40 acres alone while the cowboy watched from his sickbed, unable to stand. Clayton lived to see his 75th birthday, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, his mind still sharp even as his body failed. On a quiet morning in late autumn, he died peacefully in his sleep with Victoria holding his hand, just as he had held hers through so many difficult moments over their 42 years together. Victoria lived 3 more years without him, years she spent walking the land they had loved, telling stories to great-grandchildren who never tired of hearing about the snakebite spring, about the impossible field, about the love that had sustained them through everything. She saw Caroline receive recognition from the medical community for her contributions to frontier medicine. She saw Matthew's horses win awards at national shows. She saw Thomas expand the farm to over 200 acres, all of it productive, all of it thriving. On a spring morning when the wheat was just beginning to push green shoots through the dark soil, Victoria walked out to the original 40 acres one last time. She was 80 years old, but her steps were steady, her eyes clear. She stood in the center of the field, feeling the Montana wind on her face, and she thought about the girl she had been, the woman she had become, the life she had lived. "I did it," she whispered to the wind, to Clayton's ghost, to her own younger self. "We did it." That night, she died in her sleep, her weathered hand still bearing the faint scars of blisters earned 47 years earlier, a silver ring shaped like a wheat stalk on her finger. They buried her next to Clayton on a hill overlooking the 40 acres, and their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered to remember and celebrate the love story that had started with a snake bite and a desperate plowing, and had lasted long past death. The farm continued, generation after generation, but the original 40 acres were never sold, never divided, kept intact as a kind of monument to Victoria and Clayton Xavier, to the spring when everything had hung in the balance, to the love that had made possible the impossible. And on summer evenings, when the wheat grew tall and golden in the Montana sun, you could almost see them there, a young woman with her hands on plow handles and a young man watching from the window, their love written into the very soil, eternal as the land itself.